Thank you for coming. We'll go ahead and get started. All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the day. Nico Franz is a professor here in the School of Life Sciences, and he studies entomology and also has worked in biodiversity informatics over a number of years. And the discussion will be moderated and led by Kelle Dhein, who's a PhD student in biology and society. And just to give you a heads up for what's coming next, on November 1st, the last conversation series of the semester will be with Jessica Bolker, who's visiting from the University of New Hampshire, and myself as a host. And she'll be talking about animal models in translational research, Rosetta Stone or stumbling block. And this will be joint with the Life Science Ethics Initiative here, run by Karen Allison. All right, so I'll hand it over to Kelle and to Nico.
All right, great. So thank you, everyone, for coming to another Biology and Society conversation series. For anyone who this might be their first time, how it usually works is I'll introduce Nico, bring him up. He will do a short presentation on the conversation subject matter, and then we'll open it up. So hopefully everyone will be involved here. So Nico.
All right. Hi. All right. Thank you, Kelle, Beckett, Andrea, Jane, CBS seminar participants. So Beckett and I came up with, I could say he made me do this. That's right, Taylor. The limits of synthesis for integrative biology. The primary use case is systematics, and my hope is, and I'm trying to open it up more towards the end, that maybe you will find some parallels in your domain, and so that's the idea. So the first premise is relatively short and hopefully not too controversial. We like to talk about synthesis. It's an appealing, good term, a good concept. This is just an article reviewing a number of synthesis centers that NSF funded to sort of tackle big questions, come up with big solutions. So it's in a positive light. This might not be entirely fair as a measure of just how attractive the term is, but if you put it into an NSF award search engine, you get a lot of hits, and some of those hits come from the titles of the programs, right? So again, just to sort of set up this idea that synthesis is something positive. Now, in my particular field in systematics, the way that term or that notion has been implemented, often it has been equated with, let's find that one unitary unifying view. Truth be told, at a time, but nevertheless. So this is an example from the so-called Open Tree of Life project, multi-year, multi-million-dollar project that is, almost like a flagship for evolutionary or phylogenetic biology. And there's this idea to come up with a comprehensive tree of life, synthesized, published phylogenies, comprehensive, will fuel fundamental research, synthesizing. So you have this idea to basically come up with one coherent view. This also permeates something that I would call biodiversity informatics. Now we're more talking maybe just about a taxonomic tree with species at the tips, and then lots of specimens associated with them. One global organization that busies itself with providing this is called GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facilities. And part of GBIF's programmatic goal is to come up with a single consistent taxonomy so that everything else can sort of be hung onto that. And in their particular case, they actually have concluded that they have to assemble that taxonomy. And so they have something called the GBIF backbone, which is advertised here as a single synthetic management classification with the goal of covering all names that they're dealing with, right? They also say in the footnote, more or less, that it's updated regularly through an automated process and actually comes from 54 lower-level sources currently. You see that this is actually a version right here, so the synthesis evolves. That's just as a prelim. So how to connect this to this idea of integrating biological data. One question is, does synthesis necessarily mean one view? And I think we can upfront say, no, that might be too strong of a notion of synthesis. If you look to a dictionary, it might just say that you have to combine components to form a connected whole. That's not the same as making it all exactly one. Is equating synthesis with one hierarchy empirically and socially adequate or desirable? Likely not, if novel or conflicting views are thereby somehow suppressed, and yet these are sort of part of the scientific discourse and advancement ultimately. So here are some of the things that I will actually try to touch on in the next 15 minutes or so. What are the possible consequences of this somewhat willful equation of synthesis in one view? What are remedies? That'll get a little technical. And then towards the end, I hope to open it up and make it less technical by looking at incentives to look at synthesis differently. What are the obstacles to do so? And again, this will be illustrated, and it's going to get fairly deep into systematics for a little while, but hopefully has broader implications. I need to address one little thing up front that's possibly somewhat specific to biological naming of taxonomic entities. And that is, so what you see here, you can pretty much ignore this part. Just focus on here. So this would be a species name and a genus name. Here you would have a species name, a genus name, and a family name. The way these names are formally defined, they actually only refer to a type specimen, a single specimen by necessity. And all of these so-called non-types, so you have the realm of language and the realm of specimens, natural organisms. Only the type specimens are really fixated in that language realm. And so that means then that non-type specimens are referred to by the definitions that are added to these names, but contingently. So you could have the name Kleistes bifaria, which is for an orchid, according to one author, embrace the type, so to speak, and also various non-types. But the extension of that definition and that name according to a different author could be wider, and that would be code naming compliant, right? So you have kind of like a built-in fuzziness in this naming, where certain elements are very strictly anchored and others less so. Yeah.
So just to be clear, so like you're saying that the names specifically refer to one or two specimens in a museum, and the question is what other organisms in the wild are of the same type? Is that what you're saying? Is this hints?
Pretty much, yeah. The implications of this, I think, will become clear very soon. This is how name and name equivalence gets established, primarily in reference to a type specimen. Okay, and so here's now this use case with which I want to explain to you the problem issue or the challenge, and then I will present a remedy. This use case is for a complex named Kleistes or Kleistesiopsis. These are pogonias, a kind of southeastern U.S. Coastal orchid. And so my use case includes 20 occurrence records, meaning specimens. Think of herbarium sheets, 3 taxonomies, and 1 synthesis. So if you map these according to Radford, Ailes, and Bell, Manual of the Vascular Flora of the Carolinas, which has been called the Bible for identifying vascular plants in that region since 1968. They are all annotated to one species concept, Kleistes divaricata, and so your world looks like this, right? If, on the other hand, you select an alternative taxonomy, which has been called a federal standard by Cartez, Floristic Synthesis of North America, you get 2 taxonomic entities recognized, and the specimens would align or be identified to them in a slightly different pattern. Now, if you use, on the other hand, Wheatley's most recent and possibly most comprehensive, some will say best, flora of the southern and mid-Atlantic states, now we have 3 organisms recognized, or 3 organismal groups recognized, with some slightly more patterned distributions. So what we have here, which happens with some frequency in taxonomy, is that expert views are in conflict. The issue is that if you now choose some sort of aggregate, you might actually distort any or all of these in a way that they no longer become recognizable. So this is a real data set, raw data, meaning they are not somehow filtered according to one particular backbone yet. It's just the specimens and the name labels, how they are represented in the source herbaria. This is actually what you get in the integrated or aggregated view, where you get these different names with these different distributions. If you then impose that GBIF-like backbone onto it, you get something like this, okay, by translation. And so you see perhaps already that this particular map of distributions does not actually reconcile with any of the source views. So what are the implications of having done this synthesis? And by the way, these orchids are not just rare, but also red listed, so there's some conservation policy implications possibly. This is a little small, but it's essentially a rehash of what I had showed you, where I now also somewhat arbitrarily identify 4 regions, R1, R2, something like mountains, intermediate, east coast, southern coast, right? And so according to the Radford, Ailes, and Bell view, basically you have Divaricata being a widespread, and other units are not recognized in all of the 4 regions. And you can see here that in the Cartez case, now you have 2 entities, and neither of them is widespread any longer, so to speak. But you still have, in some cases, regions that only have 1 taxon recognized. It gets even more fine-grained. So these are 3 internally coherent source views. What happens in aggregation is they sort of get cherry-picked in not exactly equal ways, so that a subset of each view then flows into a synthesis, and that synthesis merges or reconciles by necessity these different views unevenly, so that now you all of a sudden can get novel biological inferences, such as in region 4, you have 3 different taxonomic entities represented. None of the original authors had ever asserted that, right? And at the same time, you get patterns of sympatry, things living together, or of endemism, certain regions having unique taxa that have no expert provenance, right? We can talk later about how frequently that happens, but it's sort of built into the design. So how to remedy these? The proposal is to conceive of synthesis more as a conflict exposition and alignment service than a unitary view service. And basically the solution is the next slide as proposed. Let me unpack this a little bit. So what you see here are 9 different taxonomic schemata of this complex, 1 to 9. You see that they have a certain time of being in use that goes, from 1753, when Arethusa divaricata was first described, all the way to the present. Now, the vertical columns here would be what you could consider a taxonomically congruent concept region, meaning that there's sort of notions or definitions that pick up the same set of specimens in nature, if you will, the same set of populations, somewhat irrespective of the names. These, on the other hand, are the relative name histories. And this happens because of the slide that I showed earlier about the non-matching of picking out a single type, and then whatever can be around it can oscillate, it can be divvied up, it can be sort of overlappingly allocated to different parts, right? And so we call this entire table, in some sense, an alignment, meaning what I've showed you here is an alignment where you're not just looking at the taxonomic names, but you're sort of looking at the taxonomic name according to a certain source. So you really have to combine this label with this particular qualifier of who actually used it. But then you can see that if you only had the name vocabulary, this obliquely intersecting vocabulary, how are you ever going to redesign this, right? It's a systemic sort of syntax insufficiency, if you will. If you've got name lineages and you're trying to construct this table, you can't really do it. The kicker, however, I think, is actually this, that there's no consensus across these 50 or so herbaria that are in the Southeast and that are providing specimen data. They use as many as 5 floras, taxonomic reference works, simultaneously. And locally, there might be congruence, but once you blow this up, you get incongruence. That's a general feature of how taxonomy works. Okay? So then if these incongruent taxonomies are in effect endorsed locally, provisionally, and democratically, people voting with their feet, or oftentimes it's inertia too, then what's the impact? Okay? And so I think if you had something like this in other parts of science, where you are trying to make an inference, but the inference depends on how you configure a certain variable. You try to control for the robustness of your inference by seeing what possibly can be the amplitude of the variable for you to still, be sort of subscribing to that inference or having to qualify it. And I think that's what has to happen here. We have to consider taxonomy not as a single organizing view, but as a variable. We need to represent its variation, and then we can control for it, and thereby we can sort of tackle this notion of robustness of inferences, for example, for conservation. And we need to do this at the system level because the variability may not arise at a lower level. Okay? So instead of aggregating this artificial consensus, when you have a situation where multiple expert views are in conflict, build translation services, right? And then thereby get a handle on robustness. So now I hope this was at least okay up to now. Now it gets a little technical because this is a particular solution that I've been involved with, where the idea is to redesign this aggregation pattern and really have succinct biodiversity data packages. Very abbreviated version. A lot of this is implemented in a logic reasoning tool that is really powerful and also not very easy to use. It's kind of a weird software that way. But here are some 6 steps of a proposed solution. And I think you need to understand the technicality of that in order to then also assess, what may be some of the social incentives and hurdles, so you get the complete package. So the first part of the step is to do what that table that you had just seen did, and to basically individuate, recognize taxonomic names always consistently in relation to a particular source. Okay, so you are no longer saying it's this name. You say it's this name according to Brown and Wunderlin 1997. And it's this one here, Kleistes divaricata, according to Great and Catlin, 1993. We call these taxonomic concept labels, and they are more granular, as you can see immediately, than just using this. It's like this, qualified by that. The second step would be then that the system, using something like parent-child relationships between these labels, basically can store multiple alternative views, right? So you could build a system where you have the entire 2009 taxonomy as part of the aggregation or integration platform, the entire 2008 taxonomy, and so forth. And you assemble them out of a mix of these taxonomic concept labels coming from a single source and connected to each other via parent-child relationships. So far, so good. Here's the part that's very specific, I think, to the approach that I've been working on, and that is you use a generic sort of set theory alignment language that is really quite poor semantically. It's not as strong as natural language or anything like that, but it's specifically designed just to basically answer the question, can we integrate this entity with that entity, and if so, how or not, right? And so this region collection calculus basically says if you have two entities, two sets that are congruent, it looks like this. You can also have proper inclusion or inverse proper inclusion. Partial overlap would mean that these two regions have some part that's overlapping and also a part that's unique to each. And then exclusion means you can't integrate them. They're different, non-overlapping, right? So this would be an expanded view of this type-based definition where you're really looking at set-based definitions. You can answer essentially the question with that language, can we join two regions, and if so, how? And there's a bit of a trick, and this is a part that I won't go into too much, of how to actually carve up a systematic taxonomy product so that you can put that language into use of comparing these taxonomies, right? Because there are multiple components. Anyway, so then what you would do is you would have your occurrence records, and these records that you're seeing here are sort of collection-specific identifiers for individual herbarium sheets, right? So what collections do nowadays is that we identify our records individually. It's like giving them personal names, if you will. And they are identified not to the taxonomic names, but to these concept labels, so a name according to a source. And in addition, these different taxonomic concepts have these kinds of region connection calculus assertions that would basically allow for an integration map. And what's neat is, at this point, the name string still retains all of the cognitive values that it would retain for a human, but all of the integration work is actually based upon these relationships, right? So the computer no longer sees the name strings as a primary vehicle for matching. They've been replaced in some sense. The toolkit that I've been working on is very good at turning something like this, which is like a raw input, in a globally, logically consistent alignment, which in this particular case looks actually much simpler. It sort of means basically that the folks in 1968 were lumpers. Everybody else then had a more fine-grained concept. And everything that's here in the gray box means that in spite of there being a different taxonomic concept label, they are actually taxonomically congruent, right? And one thing that the toolkit does is that if you give it as little as this, so this would be something that an expert would have to assert, it can then use logic reasoning and deduce all kinds of other statements that are logically conclusive or implied in your original statement. So the reasoner produces a comprehensive pairwise map of the articulations. And so then this map, if you have a specimen here that's identified to 1997 Pogonia divaricata, you cannot merge this with that and so forth. And so this is what the expert asserted. All of this can be logically deduced. Okay? And so then this is just a model. You would basically be able to do your querying of your integration environment by calling up any of these taxonomic concept labels. Records would be associated with them, and this map is the translation service. So if I now go back here, and I put in the name Kleistes or divaricata or something like that, what should probably not come first is a map, but the question, hey, according to whom? Okay, which view would you like? There are multiple ones that are currently in use. We can show you all of them, and we can perform all of the translations, right? So this was then would then support synthesis or aggregation. They're not synonymous, but I'm sort of blurring this here a little bit. As a translational service, we can now address queries not just like where does X occur, where X is a certain name, and then you get whatever you get. But you could have a query like show all specimens identified just to the name, which is a fuzzy kind of search tool. You get many records back, and in fact, you get back some sort of weird subsection of that table that I showed you. Or you could say, I just want this name according to weekly. Now you would get a subset of all of the specimens here, and you would essentially recover a coherent view out of the aggregate. You could also say, show me everything according to these lumping folks. I'm really interested in a broad spectrum of specimens, but then translate them into a more granular taxonomy, right? And so then you can able to see, visualize on the map, sort of like the differential of what happens as you're moving that taxonomic variable from one part of the range to the other. You would get many records, but you could basically contrast two treatments and could then get at this robustness situation. You could also find out specimens that are ambiguous cases and so on. All right. So this then was kind of the very narrow technical section. And personal story is that I have worked on this on and off for probably more than 10 years. And sometimes it's been a lot of fun for me personally. But I've also kind of arrived at a stage where I'm sort of being a little more self-reflective, maybe, because I'm not sure whether this is a good solution, and there's just something much more than it being a good solution, or whether it's a bad solution. I don't feel like it's been taking hold as much as I sort of personally believe it should be. So let me share some incentives and obstacles, and that's basically the kickoff for the conversation. Understanding the attraction of synthesis equals one view, or understanding my own failure to be more successful with this approach. Okay, so we've diagnosed an issue, a systemic issue in how we name all of biological data in every single biodiversity or, GenBank. You have it. They all have this systemic issue of not being conflict ready at all. And we have a solution. But how prevalent does the problem need to be for the aggregation design to actually change? Maybe there's something else that seems to be just as important and is easier to fix. So then something like this might get pushed back. It's not enough, I think, in general, if you're looking at a domain and you're identifying something that seems to be pretty deeply rooted wrong. Just because you've diagnosed this need not mean at all that it has to be, I guess, pretty significant for a lot of people, right? One complication is under the current one-view design system, you can't actually measure how bad you are at representing conflict because you can't represent conflict, right? So these designs are a little bit self-fulfilling in terms of making sure they look good because they never look back, right? And it would actually be helpful to just build an environment where conflict could be sort of embraced and reconciled, so you can measure the extent of conflict in these different synthetic views. And is this threshold of saying the problem is significant shared universally? Pretty clearly not, right? If I go into an aggregated environment and I look at my particular group of interest, and I see that there's something that I don't think corresponds, or there's a conflicting view or so, it means a whole lot to me. But clearly, some of these big aggregator environments are not having me in mind as their primary user, and other users, there's this notion of fitness for use, can do a lot of meaningful biology, or at least publish a lot of biology to meaningfully advance their career without having the same threshold of tolerance that I would have. I hope that makes sense. Are these aggregation systems, and I'm now slowly sliding more maybe into even big data type issues or so, designed to foster distrust, particularly among, and career advancing is not a great adjective here. What I want to say is that possibly earlier career stage scientists that really have to publish, and what they have to publish is sort of has to be impactful partly because it is dissenting, right? And so those folks that, are especially tasked, I think, in our academic environment to come up with something that actually kind of breaks the mold in one way or the other? Do they somehow get particularly shorted with this synthesis equals one view situation? Is it kind of like to propagate some sort of more established scientific subcommunity? Is the sweeping under the rug, quote unquote, of conflict by now an expectation that's just grounded in the long history of our field? Maybe you might say, for crying out loud, it's 2017. Shouldn't we have figured out these species already, right? You hear these kinds of views often from experts. Why can't we have one unified web page for every species? I've heard that painfully often, and I think it's very intellectually shallow. Or the other one here. We're so close, NSF, 95% there. We almost got this, right? Fund us once more, and then we have the synthesis, right? After that, we won't ask you for money anymore. Yeah, it's appealing. Is it that by using, sort of this riding the big data wave, we are also increasingly just saying that quieting down of conflict is just an acceptable design feature? Are we okay with that? It might be the case. A few more. This is my last slide. I also think that on a more personal level, better integration where you would account for the possibility that whatever you come up with now either conflicts with some past, present, or future view requires a kind of cognitive adjustment where you're basically saying, as I'm publishing these data, I'm making it especially easy for my predecessor or successors to sort of prove me wrong and make that wrongness of me really transparent. Yeah, that's not too comfortable. Maybe we're asking too much here by annotating your data so rigorously and comparing them with another view that you don't actually subscribe to. It might just not really run very well with how we generally conceive of each other as scientists, right? It would also likely force both contributors and users to be more transparent upfront with this idea of fitness for use and aims of integration, right? And so then, in some sense, one of the struggles, I think, with implementing this very logic specified view is that it makes a lot of assumptions that people are pretty comfortable to not express, forces them to express them. And that seems to be asking a lot of a scientist. So this is more like a pondering. It does seem that we are in the process of giving something up for the sake of big data integration in biology. And personal opinion, as many of these things, I think we might have to become slightly better logicians and slightly more critical users of software. One of the paradigms that I see a lot in biology are these open biomedical ontology, OBO, structured vocabularies. They have any and all of the issues that I sort of pointed out to, but the other thing is that they are tied to a type of logic reasoning called the descriptive logic, OWL reasoning, that has a really convenient software that biologists can download and use, right? But having worked a little bit with logicians, the kind of logic is actually not suited for the sort of exception-rich and very rule-rich biological reasoning that we, for example, would do in evolutionary biology. So if you want to do things like mammals have hair, but then in whales, hair got secondarily modified into whatever it is that whales have that doesn't look like hair superficially, right? OWL is not good for that. It basically cannot do that. So you have to sort of, and too often, I think the way we've designed integration has been driven by things like, hey, here's a tool that biologists are pretty comfortable with, and that seems on the surface to do the kinds of reasoning services that they're interested in, and everybody's kind of looking the other way for the exceptions. So I think in general, I might claim that dealing with productive ambiguity and with productive conflict in the way that we do, sort of like in the sprint paradigm, integrative biology, where a lot of the contextualization and the interpretation essentially happens, at the time and place that one researcher interprets the view of another researcher. We haven't really translated that at all yet into the, because we're using these much more stricter languages that don't seem to be able to deal with context and conflict and so forth. And then finally, the personal issue. If you find yourself like you're convincing yourself that you're sitting on something, that you kind of want to raise your hand in the big group, and at what point do you stop? That's all I have. Thank you again for Kelle, everybody from the CBS, some of my collaborators on this Euler integration team. If you have to read one paper, it's that, but I've published quite a bit on that. Yeah. Practical implications, taxonomic revisions, aligned phylogenies, conceptual papers, and so forth. All right.
Great. So I'm going to start it off by asking a question to Nico, and anyone in the audience can feel free to jump in, raise their hands whenever they want. While you're giving this talk, an idea occurred to me, and the question occurred to me, sort of what the goal of a project like this is, a very long-term goal. So you've proposed a way to synthesize disparate systems of knowledge to make the conflicts explicit between those two systems of knowledge. Do you think that in the long run, structuring things like that will cause the conflicts to be figured out? Or is it that you think that's just the best kind of database to have, the kind of database that makes conflicts explicit?
Thank you. I think the systems could potentially be built for just indefinite conflict. And I think indefinite conflict may well be it's just a different way of saying disciplinary matrix specificity, right? We have a limited number of sort of strings that our human brains are comfortable with, and so we individuate them slightly differently. And there's like a historical notion of homology, where it's something that somehow transformed and makes natural this particular group, and there's maybe a deeper developmental genetic notion of homology, right? That's I think both of those have very good reasons to coexist and be reconciled. So it's so if you don't want to say conflict, you can just say a plurality of perspectives, right? And my understanding of contemporary sort of philosophy of science is that, that's something that you want to build for. Yeah. Otherwise, it's not just that you can't really progress, but you can't also accommodate sort of like multiple subdisciplines via integration, because you're forcing not just the vocabulary, but the specific meanings from one community onto the next that has its own mechanisms of using those terms and succeeding in their inferential needs with them.
That's a...
So you mentioned red listing and sort of from a practical point of view. Like a week from today in this room, at this time, there will be a big red list workshop going on. And people who do red listing, the starting point has to be with a genus and species and a known taxon. So if you were to address a group of red listers, would you advocate that there might be a way to sort of go one step back so that there's a consistent philosophy leading up to the taxon?
Yeah, I mean, that's
whole stage that these practitioners in conservation would use?
So thank you, Andrew. I think I sort of had this semi-canned. This is a paper from 1999, so it's close to 20 years old. You can read the title, Alternative Species Concept as Basis for This was prior to all of this digitization really taking hold. But it's got some cool graphs here where you're looking basically at Mexico through the lens of one species concept for birds and another one, right? And you are getting different highlights for areas of endemism. So compare, for example, this coastal region here being kind of like mid-level priority versus high-level priority, and then translate it into different conservation priorities. So at least as of 1999, somebody had published that which species concept you use is a variable, and here's the relative robustness, right? Whichever one you use, you still get the same inference for this region of Mexico, but you don't for that region of Mexico, right? So we've kind of known this for a while, that we should do this, and yet you get things like this 18 years later, where some folks from Australia basically argue whenever there's conflict, and I'm not kidding, we should bring lawyers into this. Okay, it's not one of those things where we don't need to bring lawyers into this. They actually are saying right here, subcommittees should review taxonomic papers. On the basis of that review process, there would be the first standardized, right? So you see I'm already throwing up in my mouth. And, sorry. And needs to establish a judicial committee, yeah? I don't think that's true to the science. If the science, which also occurs in a social context, gives you this signal right here democratically, then that's the signal that you want to possibly build your conservation designs for and after. Because if not, you're sort of ostracizing or somehow diminishing this idea. And I think what would happen practically is that you would see for probably 90 or 95% of the groups that there would be enough of a consensus for a relatively unified policy. And then for the other 5%, which may be very, very important 5%, you would represent the conflict and you would build that into your hopefully conflict-robust conservation inferences. Yeah. This is also, I think, a big social opportunity because it's very hard to get taxonomists ever excited about these syntheses. Even though the taxonomic community is not, the most well-funded or the most powerful, they are really good, kind of like in a nasty way, of embarrassing a aggregator or a higher body with, these kinds of arguments. Hey, wait a minute, have you looked at this? Have you looked at this? This specimen is wrong, and so forth, right? So you possibly, but there is some sort of cost of losing the PR war or gaining the PR war, but you're going to have some sort of PR conflict with the taxonomic community if you do this. And you're designing it into your system, and you're basically saying, we're accepting that. Dhein.
Well, so along those lines, so it sounds like, if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like you're saying, all right, so for this taxonomic process, we need to add more data fields, and then we'll contextualize better. And when we do that and we analyze the data, it will make a difference. So you, being a smart guy, must have done experiments to say, and so when we do it the right way, the way I would like, it has these consequences. And so it can show, Andrew, that in fact, if you do the database right, then you will need to do X rather than Y. So do you have...
No, I haven't built it yet. No. So I can actually not build this myself. I've certainly submitted more than one proposal to do this. These data here are, I would say, like 90% real, but I generated them because there's a database that I could just totally hack. And I could basically display all the data according to our taxonomy, then I could wipe that taxonomy out. And that's not actually the kind of access that a typical aggregator would give me.
And you need some kind of complex system that does not just triple store, but quadruple.
So these things do exist, but they are oftentimes not efforts of, some sort of provenance that's, so here, for example, so it's interesting that for birds, people have come up with these solutions more frequently that I've just outlined than for any other taxonomic group. And I'm guessing that is because a lot of people care about birds, And that's pretty much it. Bird taxonomies change. There are multiple worldwide sort of aspiring authorities that put out annual checklists. From one checklist to another within the annual checklist, within the authority, there's always changes. And then across the authorities, there's always changes. But the kicker is actually that people care about it here enough for this. That moves this threshold, right? Because they make these checklists, and so, there's a lot of people. And so you have this service here that's called Compare Taxonomies, where you can basically select Howard and Moore, version such and such, and I hope this is going to work, and the Handbook of Birds, and then you can say version such and such, and you can say submit, and it gives you the differential. It gives you the delta. This particular website does not yet reach to the specimen level. It could, but it's basically reconciling something like 150 different bird taxonomies with each other. Pretty much because one person decided that it was important. It was not a democratic process. They just decided they can do it. Yeah. So these examples exist, and they speak to the feasibility of the design, right? But then there's this whole other thing about, so it's good, it's feasible, but there's got to be something else that makes an idea take off or not. I don't have to tell you that, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes?
So you mentioned earlier about taxonomists being maybe good at kind of wrecking these systems. Over the years, I've heard from taxonomists a lot of kind of oh, hey guys, not necessarily just about aggregators, but about a bunch of different things. Hey, the fundamental way that we're doing things has certain assumptions, and we know those things are wrong. Is there any reason why you think taxonomists might be these people that seem to be pointing out oh, hey, the foundations of this system or this system are built on quicksand?
Well, so within sort of comparative biology, taxonomy is a little more on the historical side as opposed to the experimental one or whatever, right? And so then you get into the situation, and evolution is complicated, right? And you have extinction variously being your friend or not, depending on how it works. And so I think there's a general awareness in the field that when you make historical inferences, there's an inductive chain, and there might be issues, right? I think that's that, right? Maybe also a little bit, this is not, I don't think, a good opportunity for pointing the finger in one or the other direction, but so if you conceive of something almost like a spiral of changing taxonomic views, right? That this field of taxonomy produces, and that it has some sort of notion of provenance from one to the next. At any given point in time, there is this expectation, not just from society, but within taxonomy as well, that you can check out your version and you can do meaningful biology with that, right? That assumption is both wrong and approximately right. So, yeah.
The word translation, you suggested that there are translations between the various taxonomies, and that's very reassuring, but are translations always possible? And that is without loss, because the information that's collected for each one of them might be quite incomplete, bound to be incomplete.
Right.
And consequently, there's no guarantee that it's going to be a neat translation between the two.
Yeah.
And second, insofar as there are translations, what are the standards of a good translation?
So I'm not sure I can somehow mend this into using this slide, but if you, for example, weren't sure whether you have two taxonomic concepts, so two descriptions and specimens deposited by different authors that you are sort of studying up on, if you will, or you're a second author trying to study up on a previous author, you could just express ambiguity by saying it's either this or that or that. So this very simple language of 5 terms actually turns into a language of 32 terms when you look at all of the possible or combinations, that disjoint options. So that's a way to build in ambiguity. And then if you would try to do an alignment between two taxonomies that had a measure of these ambiguous articulations, what you would get is a cloud of possible world alignments, right? That's how you translate or fail to translate precision in this particular reasoning environment. I think there is a normative aspect to doing this that would actually in the future force taxonomists to, so when we do like a species description or so, for example, of a plant, we actually say whether the plant is like a tree or a shrub or an herb, but very rarely are those like species diagnostic characters. Sometimes they're just in there because the editor told us, you have to say something about how long the leaves are. And so I think the average taxonomic description is this mash of characters that are very sort of diagnostic. They help you tell species apart, versus they might be phylogenetically informative. They give you bigger groups of species, and that are just fillers, right? And so you don't necessarily need to translate all, but you do need to have the sender and the receiver understand which is which. And I think you could be better at annotating that. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm persuaded that one can be clearer than we typically are,
right,
and more precise than we typically are.
Yeah.
Are those clear and precise notions always as usable as the ones that are not?
Right. No, they're not. The point of this project is, and for me at least has been pretty much the whole time, is to see how far I can push the boundary in terms of sort of implementing a logic-like precision into comparing taxonomic concept, and whether that's actually desirable or not is both connected, but for me it's actually almost secondary, because I need to know how far this could potentially be done out of curiosity. Yeah, go ahead.
Question. Following up on what he just said, he said we could be clearer than we actually are.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, who's we? And what I mean by that is, who sets the standard? Is it a U.S. standard? Is it a German, a Norwegian, a Chinese? Who sets the standard? Like, if you went to an international conference with your colleagues,
mm-hmm.
and you're all talking,
Mm-hmm.
who sets the standard?
I get it. It's a good question. So it's definitely not me. and my only tool has been actually what Jane has sort of alluded to show how this makes biology better, and then sort of naively assume that the weight of the demonstration will metastasize into implementation, right? Not necessarily. So I don't want to be too down. There's actually now a journal that's out of Bulgaria that's kind of like on the forefront of biodiversity data publishing. They are implementing this language and thereby forcing future authors to use it, right? So that could be considered some sort of Pyrrhic victory. And there's now also a taxonomic workbench that has much fewer users that, as of 2 days ago, is starting to implement this, right? So, but it would be kind of almost like ironic if you are legislating top-down a system that advocates plurality. You know what I mean? But I don't have access to democratic processes that set any standards.
So when
Yeah.
people do push back against
Yeah.
your aggregation
Yeah.
procedure,
Yeah.
is that one of the complaints, that they don't need all that nuance, or that sometimes when they reach into the taxonomic bucket, they just want one name and they don't want to hear about all the fuss around it?
I think sort of this point is actually kind of prevalent, right? Because if and when you are publishing your data at that moment, you tend to publish them, or we tend to publish them in such a way that we feel like it's just the right match between what's there written on paper, kind of like for anybody to pick up, and the complement that's in my head to actually give it exactly the meaning that or somehow the meaning, right? Going back to Rick very quickly, I think there definitely is purposeful and necessary ambiguity built in, and for good reasons built into a lot of taxonomic concepts, right? But I don't think the ambiguity needs to be as, and then I'll go back to you, Kelle, as dramatic as this, where there's just one specimen that we know is tied to this name for sure, and the rest is like this malleable cloud, and that's the best that we can design, and that best reflects how well we understand each other. I don't think so. But I think in terms of what are obstacles for acceptance, I think this is in some sense, and not to sound too grandiose, trying to change kind of like a pretty basic aspect of how we communicate via taxonomic names. So it's either a tiny issue or a big issue, but you can kind of like run it both ways. But I think it's sort of this issue. So why do I need to do this for somebody else, including like for a machine, right? I get my data. Probably my most closest peers that I'm addressing when I write my introduction, at least in taxonomy, sort of like when I write a taxonomic paper, I think about like the extended handful of people that I feel like are on the level of understanding the paper. They get pretty much exactly that much. I think that's how natural language very often works, right? You know a crap load of stuff about your audience, and that's how you're going to write it, right? So now you're going to have to write it in such a way that it's more explicit, almost like for, like a novice or an uninitiated entity, including a machine, so that it can be scalable. It's much easier just to figure out one standard, and the standard has fuzziness and ambiguity and conflict quieting built into it, but it gets us there pretty quick, and we don't have to change our sort of everyday practices. I think that's one of the obstacles. It's what today seems like sort of like selfless needs to be turned into something that's considered selfish. So it's selfish for me to annotate my data so that somebody in the future can more easily link to them and prove me wrong. And that needs to be part of my own personal career advancement. That you can see how that can be a tough one.
Okay, so picking off on what you just said, that would lead to
Jim.
some... Okay.
So sorry.
Just quickly, so Nico, I think this also relates to what Rick was questioning.
Uh-huh.
Don't you have to have some way to weight these different contributors to a potential synthesis? In other words, it seems to me that when you clicked on 156,
Yeah.
all of them, well, we didn't see anything in the background, but you don't want to be weighting each one equally, do you? Are different approach is going to be more or less, varying quality to some degree?
Nope. No. The idea that the very workflow of integration should already have that built in, right? I think is what this goes against, right? What it then goes for is indeed that the system is sort of at face value reflecting these different views, and the process of putting the weights can follow simultaneously or thereafter, but not up front, right? There's nothing in this design that would preclude you from saying, I really like this view or I really like that view, right? But if you only get this, and yet there's these other conflicting views, then the game is kind of like over before it started. Yeah.
Good. One more question here.
Answer Rick's question and what Jim was bringing up is that there, in your title, you have the word integrative zoology or biology, and
I did.
As we become more integrative, there are more and more people who are providing data that are useful from a taxonomic perspective that know nothing about taxonomy. And so we end up, at least I've found in a practical sense, trying to adjudicate even the small little group of organisms I work on. I have people yelling at me from both sides, and people will say, well, this is different or this is the same, and I have these data, but they will never, ever make any attempt to actually solidify the taxonomy based on the data that they present, but whether it's genetic or morphological. The morphologists know what they're doing, but the geneticists don't always. And they just say, well, this is different. So, and then they just leave it on the table.
Yeah.
And so you don't know exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not.
It's very difficult to put all these pieces together.
Right.
When you're not holding the cards.
Yeah. I mean, I have done this thinking that there may be some rhyme or reason to, first of all, like almost as a drawing on a whiteboard, to see what a model would look like, that where we don't immediately go into who's right and who's wrong before we even start hitting keystrokes, right? And so I'm not unaware that there are anything from resignation to name calling to overconfident attitudes are certainly out there. Yeah.
Well, it's 1 p.m.
Fine.
So that is going to be it for this conversation series. Thanks for coming out.